Hello guys, so welcome to today is day 16 of your Python programming learning, and then today we are going to be looking at how to debug. Now, what exactly do I mean by debugging? Debugging, when I say debugging, I'm basically trying to imply that okay, there are some times whereby you're trying to write your program, and then while trying to write your program, you just discover that your program is not working the way you expect it to work, or you're writing a program and then the program is giving you some sort of errors. So the question is, how do you solve? How do you get out of those errors? So to get out of those errors, you need to do what we call debugging, and debugging is something that implies you trying to trace back those steps to figuring out where exactly was this thing wrongly written, or where exactly was this thing wrongly stated, or where exactly is the problem coming from. Now, most of the reasons why you come across things like that is due to the fact that you're having various type of errors. So I'm sure a lot of you guys must have been seeing a lot of errors like syntax errors, attribute errors, indentation errors, type errors, and a lot of errors like that, system error, you know, tab error and the likes. But I'm just going to be focusing on um, four key type of errors that you must have been encountering very often. So the rest will be we are going to be making references to the other ones so that you can actually know how to solve those ones. All right. So the first type of error is the type error. Yeah, is the type error, and the type error is actually a type of error that is raised when a function or operation is applied to an object to an object that is not of that particular type that is it expects. Do you get it? So, for example, you have you have let's say um, okay, whatever, whatever. Let's say you have x to be a tuple, right? A tuple of 23, 14, 14, and 214 and then 12, right? So now, like I said, a type error is what? A type error is a type of error that you get whenever if when a function or an operation is applied to an object of an incorrect data type. Now, for example, let's say you have a function called sum. Okay, let's say okay, sum is going to work in this case. It's not going to give us a type error. Let's say you have pow. Okay, now we know that pow takes in a particular value, let's say 2, an integer especially, and then the power, that is 2 raised to power 3, and then it gives you 8, right? Now let's now say pow x to 2. Let's see what it gives us. It gives us a type error. So it's basically trying to say that what Python is basically trying to tell us in this case is, if you pass in if your function, which is pow, or whatever function that you've built, is expecting you to take in um, a string, and then you pass in an integer, it's going to pull up a type error. Now in this case, pow expected an integer. Do you get it? But we gave it a tuple. Do you get it? But if we actually said that pow x index 0, let's say we are trying to just refer to 23 raised to power 2 comma 2, it shouldn't give us an error. So it's just going to say x index 0 is 23, so 23 raised to power 2 is 529. So that is the type error. So let's just write another one. Let's say another function, let's say sum up. So let's say sum up takes in it takes in an iterable, let's say f. Do you get it? So we are now saying that for k in f, let us have k plus, let's just say okay, I should have initialized j. Let me just cancel this. me cancel this. Let me say j is equals to 0, and I'm saying for k in f, right, we want to have j plus equals to k, right, and then we want to return j, that is the sum of all the values. So we are expecting f to be an array of numbers. So if so, it could be a tuple, it could be a list, it could be a set. As long as it is an iterable, yeah, it's just going to keep moving from one to the other. Now let's go ahead and then call this function sum up, and let's pass in, okay, um, or let me just say b is equals to 23, 23, or let me just pass in x, sum up x. Now it added 23 plus 214 plus 12, right, and it gave us 249. Do you get it? Now imagine, and I'll say sum up 12. It's going to give me an error, type error, because it expected an iterable, and then what I passed in was just an integer. Do you get it? So passing in an integer into, if your function expected, um, when you are getting an error like this, see, it says type error int object is not an iterable. It means that what you've passed in is not an iterable. So if you look at this, one thing to do to debug, to find out where the problem is actually coming from, is look at where that error is coming from. It's coming from here. So which means that for k in f, now the question is, what is f? Is f an iterable? So f is actually f should be an iterable, but in this case your f was passed in as just an integer, so that's the reason why you have the type error. So another thing I also want to talk about is the indentation error. So for example, let's say you are trying to write a Python script, like let me just rewrite this def. I wrote this function right now, and when I got here, when I pressed enter, it jumped here. Now in Python, when you're trying to write your function, let me just move on to the editor to just to make myself much more clearer. All right, so you have a function called sum up, right? um, let's say it takes in k, and then now you discover that when I pressed enter from here, and I pressed enter, it left some spaces here. That's the indentation. When you're writing a function like this, there has to be some indentation. If there's no indentation, then you need to create indentation yourself by leaving like 4 to 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's just say four spaces, or if you want a 5, but let's just stick to 4. And then you write whatever you want to write. Okay, for let's just initialize j to because 0. For I in k, let us do j plus equals I. And then now you discover that in a for loop also, whenever you start, okay, let me just run this first. Return j. Now you discover that when I pressed the return statement, it came back to this point here. Now imagine, if I run this code right now, let me just go ahead and save. um, so let me just save it. You can just go ahead and save your own script. So um, um, if you let me just pass in sum up x. Let me assume my x is is a list: 34, 12, 67, 34. Now the reason why it will also work for a list is because a list is an iterable. As long as whatever you're passing is an iterable, it's going to work. All right, so let's go ahead and run this program. Oh, it didn't print out anything, so let's go back to our program and let's print it out so that we can see it. Oh, it's supposed to return something, so let's say our return is x return. All right, so let's just say print x return. Right. So click on your F5, then you go to your shell, it says 147. Now let's go back to our editor. Now it's working fine, right? Now imagine I now decided that I just want to have my j from here, bring it down here. There has to be an indentation whenever you have your for loop coming down, whenever you're pressing an enter into your for loop. Python automatically does that for you, but let's just try and run this and see if our program is going to work fine. We're expecting an indentation error. Now if you look at it, when you're trying to run it, there's going to be a pop-up on your screen saying that there's an error in your program, expected an indented block. That means that is an indentation error. Do you get it? That is an indentation error. So now look at it. This place is colored red, which means Python is trying to bring your attention to this part that it expects an indentation after a for loop. So now let's return it back. So if we run it back, we should still have that 147. Now, what if we take this and then we indent it? Let me just take this back. Let me explain this. Let me just do some funny things, and then let me just have this like this. Now it's still going to give me the same thing. If you run it F5, it's still going to tell you there's an error in your program, expected an indented block. So Python is not going to work when you do not obey syntax, when you do not put your indentation. This should have been explained from the start, but you know, I'm so sorry we didn't explain that from the start, but I'm just trying to call your attention to all of these things. Now, if you put it back, you should have a. So now, what am I trying to emphasize? When you write a for loop like this, no matter where you start writing your for loop for whatever in whatever, right? And then it should always indent automatically for you. So that is another thing. And if you are writing your if statement, if x in y, it will always indent for you automatically. And if you do not do that, it's going to give you an error. Now another thing I also want to point out that I've noticed that you guys made a lot of mistake about is this sort of error. Right. Now if you run this guy, let's see what happens. F5. Now if you go to your shell, you discover that nothing is being printed out. Now why is nothing being printed out? Now in Python, when you write your scripts like this, you are basically trying to tell Python that Python, I'm writing a function called SumUp, and then inside SumUp you have all of this in this function. So Python is just going to assume all of this is part of the function, whereas they are not part of the function. This is what you are using to test this function. This is what you are using to call this function. Do you get it? Now in this case, it's not an error. It's not giving you any form of error, and it's not printing out anything. Do you get it? Okay, luckily let's just say we call SumUp, right? Let's see if it's going to give us some sort of error. Yeah, it's not going to give us any form of error actually. So let's just say x SumUp x SumUp x. Let's assume our x is defined. Now to z. Okay, let's assume our x is, let me copy this guy again. Alright, so let's assume our x is that, and then we now say, okay, let's say this is our y, and then let's print. Actually this is not going to give you an error, but I just want to emphasize something. This should be outside your function, not inside. Now if you put anything like this inside your function, then you are basically trying to say that x is a local variable. It's local in this function. In fact, this is not even totally correct, because it's not really correct. Like Pythonistas don't really write scripts like this. So the best you can do when you run this, I don't think you should have any form of error. So if you look at our shell, yeah, it's working fine, but still it's not good enough. Actually, it's not really good enough. So the best, you have to be very careful. You have to know the difference between when you are calling your function and then when you are writing your function and when you're actually testing your function. This is function testing. Alright, so I want to believe you guys know that pound sign This is writing the function itself, writing the function itself. All right, so I want to believe that you guys also know that this hash sign is, it means comment. It means comment. So Python doesn't when it comes across this hash sign, this pound sign, it ignores whatever that is there. It moves to the next line, and it moves to the next line. Run this, come to this line. This one is empty space. Come to this line. This a pound sign again. It's going to ignore whatever is here. Come to this line. Run, and that's just going to be it. Now, one last thing that I want to talk about. I've spoken about the type error, the indentation error. I want to talk about, okay, let me just go back to my shell and talk about syntax error. So for example, let's say you're trying to write x, you're trying to write x is equals to 12, 34. Let's just put some strings here. um, 34, 23, and then like this, right? This is this is correct, right? Now imagine you now say x, you used square, you used the brackets here. Now let us now use, this is a square bracket that you started with a square bracket, you ended with a square bracket. Now let's start with a curly bracket. Mistakenly we didn't know, and then we just went ahead to write the same thing, and then we said okay 23, and then we ended on with the square brackets. It's going to give us a syntax error. It's basically trying to tell us that it doesn't understand what you mean by starting with a square bracket and ending with starting with a curly bracket and ending with a square bracket. So when you have syntax errors like this, it means that you've basically written something that is invalid, or maybe you write something like this, right? 12, and then you call two commas at the same time. Let's see if it's going to give us an error or something like this. It's still going to give us an error because number one, it doesn't know what this, why you are writing two commas together at the same time. It doesn't. Another thing is this exclamation mark. It doesn't understand what it means. So that is what we mean by syntax error. When you come across syntax error, the it means that what you've just written, or what you've just written in your program, there's some form of invalidity. Python doesn't understand what you're trying to write. So you need to check and then write them very well. Then the last thing I want to talk about is the attribute error. I said I want to just talk about four types of errors. Actually, there are more than that, but I just want to talk about the ones that you've been encountering, that we've noticed that you guys have been making a lot of mistakes about. So we just want to correct that. So the attribute error is basically, for example, you have x. X is actually what? A list, right? Now, and then let's say we have y, which is a string, right? Let's say a string of right. This is a string. So when we click enter, Python understands that, yeah, y is a string. So if you say what is y, y is a string. What is x? X is actually a list. Now, what is type error? Type error is basically more or less like, for example, let's say you say x dot lower, right? Now, x dot x is actually a list. A list doesn't have an attribute of lower. So when you press enter, it's going to give you an attribute error telling you that list object has no attribute lower, and it's going to tell you where the problem is coming from. Line 1. It's going to tell you the line you've just written, there's an error there. List doesn't have an attribute of dot lower. But if you do y dot lower, right, it's gonna give you what you want. You say y dot upper, it's gonna give you what you want because they are strings, and strings have attribute of dot lower or dot upper. Now, what if you say um, what if you say something like, just still with this example string and list, let's say you say, let's give an attribute of a string to a list. So we have x to be a list, right? So let's say x dot or let's give an attribute. We've given an attribute of a string to an attribute of a string to of a list to a string. So let us give an attribute of a list to a string. Let's try the extend. or let's just try the append. So we have x is what? We have y, right, to be this. Now let's try y dot append. Let's say we want to add e to this last value. Let's append e, and let's see if we are going to get an error. So when we run this, Python is going to tell us string object has no attribute append, because this is a string, y is a string, and then you can't append a string to a string, but you can concatenate. Yeah, plus y plus e is going to add it up. But if you do your x dot append e, right, it's going to append it. So when you say x, you find it there. All right, so that's just going to be what all our that's just what our tutorial is just going to be about today. So tomorrow we are going to be talking more about error handling, the try and accept. All right, stay tuned, and then see you tomorrow. Bye.